Religion is an institution specific to humans. Humans have held metaphysical beliefs from their earliest days, but the institution of religion has been with us for thousands of years and is characteristic in the identity of almost any modern civilization. Regardless of what thinks about religion as a whole, it is here to stay with us for the foreseeable future. Since the Enlightenment, most Western societies, and those influenced in such a political tradition, have found it expedient and righteous to separate the church and the state. While the debate about the dangers of the unification between church and state rages on within nations like the United States, some countries operate more negative views towards religious institutions. Our favorite egalitarian paradise, North Korea, seemingly takes the latter approach. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea has a religion-adjacent political ideology that deifies its leaders and portrays its socialist system as capable of delivering paradise on earth. It would appear to the casual observer that, although officially an atheist state, a strict orthodoxy of faith persists and will continue to exist for quite some time. In today's video, we will be analyzing what religious institutions exist in North Korea. We will analyze their presence, their roles, if any, in North Korean society, and address the legality of worship within the country. Religion in Korea stretches far back into the mists of time. The earliest of the documented religions in Korea is Toseok Sinang, or Way of the Spirit, more commonly known as Korean shamanism. It is a polytheistic religion with many supernatural beings of varying tiers of divinity. According to the religion, spirits interact with humanity via mediators or priests known as mu or mundang, whose job it is to settle disputes between humans and spirits. These disputes range from humans encroaching on spirit land to burial rites and helping lost ghosts pass on to heaven. Korean shamanism is still practiced today and is a potential candidate for the oldest extant religious belief, predating even Judaism or Zoroastrianism by an undetermined but likely significant amount of time. One such example of Korean shamanism that thrives in modern-day Korea is fortune-telling. Many Koreans visit these fortune tellers regularly for career advice, marriage prospects, and financial counsel. While the rest of Asia's folk religions largely dissipated in favor of Buddhism or Taoism, neither succeeded in replicating their success in the land of the morning calm. Korean shamanism would remain the dominant religious belief until the 19th century, when, due to the influx of foreign missionaries in the Joseon dynasty, Christianity slowly supplanted shamanism, despite decades of persecution by the Korean government. Like in many other countries visited by foreign missionaries in the 19th century, Christians built schools that offered many children a religious, yet Western education. One benefit of these schools was that they were often gender agnostic, giving young girls the chance to receive a proper education when it was extraordinarily uncommon for Korean girls to attend school. Kim Il-sung's mother, Kang Pan-sok, a Presbyterian deaconess, was a beneficiary of such schools. Christianity in particular became remarkably prevalent in northern Korea due to the ever-increasing amount of missionaries arriving in the area. Christianity became so popular that foreigners had dubbed Pyongyang the, quote, Jerusalem of the East. As the 19th century began to sunset into the annals of history, Korea gave birth to a Korean nationalist religious movement known as Chandoism. Born out of a desire to expel foreign influences such as Christianity and Buddhism, Chandoism can be explained as a marriage of Korean shamanism and Confucianism by incorporating many of their practices. While Chandoism borrowed many characteristics from shamanism, it is noteworthy that they are distinct from each other, as Korean shamans do not acknowledge themselves as Chandoists or vice versa. Chandoism is distinct from other religions in that God and heaven are not seen as inherently separate entities, but the same, and that when one dies, they are not transported to a magical place, but returned to an inner spirit where all of humanity allegedly originates. Chandoism was initially popular amid peasants in the late 19th century, due to it being born out of the ashes of the Donghak Peasant Rebellion, the catalyst which led to the First Sino-Japanese War. With Japan's decisive victory over Qing China in 1895 and consequent annexation of Korea 15 years later, Japanese authorities began persecuting Chandoists, which had the adverse effect of effectively making Chandoism the face of the Korean resistance movement against the Japanese occupation. This effort led to Chandoism becoming the second most prevalent religious belief in Korea by the end of the Second World War. During the Japanese occupation, Christians were also persecuted, albeit to a far lesser extent than Chandoists due to the number of foreign missionaries involved. Membership in a church was discouraged, however, Japanese authorities tacitly permitted missionaries to go about their business, albeit on a tight leash for good measure. Despite being the offspring of devout Presbyterians and reared in the church, Kim grew disdainful of religion when he became involved in the Korean resistance movement. He publicly decried religion, especially Christianity, proclaiming it a tool by the imperialists in the Korean peninsula. Although verifiable sources are scarce to non-existent, the state of religion in North Korea today tells us that sometime after the division of Korea and Kim Il-sung's rise to power, religious persecution soon followed. While it is not known precisely when these expurgations began, during the Korean War, millions of refugees fled to South Korea to escape religious persecution. Additionally, one can hypothesize that it likely transpired after the Korean War, since virtually all of North Korea's infrastructure was destroyed, including most of the churches that existed in the country. With a mass exodus of believers of all faiths and the destruction of church infrastructure, this conclusion likely gave Kim Il-sung a blank slate to develop the country in his image, with the subsequent Cholima movement, which Kim used to consolidate his position as the ultimate authority in the country. With religion effectively neutralized and any political opposition quelled, Kim Il-sung had enough foresight to understand that the uniformity of Soviet communism would not fit Korea's cultural characteristics. Understanding that a guiding ideology of collectivism with Korean characteristics is needed to inspire Koreans to follow their leader and to keep the growing de-Stalinization movement from reaching North Korea, the Juche idea was born, which would effectively supplant religious belief in the country away from divine beings and towards the supreme leader. A lot of people might like to conclude Juche itself is a religion. While this might make sense on the surface, it is keen to understand that Juche is a replacer for a religion, not religion in of itself. Allow me to elaborate. The North Korean leader cult is one of the most expansive and powerful in the world, possibly even in history. This cult, like the Roman imperial cults of old, postulates that the leader is a superhuman being with divine qualities. However, it stops short of ever blatantly ascribing godhood to the Kims or the Kim family. Within the Juche ideology, the Kims are deity adjacent. Now, what does this mean? It means that the leader cult is akin to a religion, but is not quite a religion. For example, all people in North Korea believe that the Kims are superhuman, superintelligent, the purveyors of all good. However, they don't think they are gods like Jesus who are off resurrecting people from the dead and rising from the dead or bringing down lightning on the enemies of North Korea. Nor is there any promise of eternal life or damnation for those who choose or choose not to follow the Kims. There is no rhetoric of Kim Il-sung returning from the dead to save his followers like in Abrahamic religions, nor is there any talk of reincarnation or transcending the spirit, a common trope in Eastern religions. Some people would counter this by pointing out all of the superhuman capabilities attributed to the Kims by North Korean propaganda as direct evidence of the deification of the leaders. However, it's imperative to understand that the Kim dynasty is supposed to be worthy of dictatorial royal leadership because of their shared heritage as the Mount Paektu bloodline, the purest and greatest scions of the pure and great Korean race, not endowed with supernatural abilities by God or because they are considered divine, but because they are the purest example of what is already considered to be a master race. This point is further reinforced by the ever-changing and fluid Juche ideology, a system of thought which is kept deliberately opaque and vague on all issues except for one, that the Kims are infallible leaders of the Korean nation, but that their legitimacy and supernatural qualities come from the single-hearted unity that the populace places in them, not through divine means. This system is very different from the notion of the divine right of kings, which claims that the ruler is either selected by God because of his perfection, or is individually perfect because he is a god. On the other hand, Kim Il-sung's autobiography Within the Century acknowledges that he lives as an instrument of the Korean nation, one with messianic and godlike powers, but not a god himself. To contrast, the Emperor of Japan to this day is still considered a living deity, with the lineage to the goddess Amaterasu herself. In conclusion, we should understand that although Kim Il-sung is loved, revered, immortalized as the father of the revolution, and is considered the ceremonial head of state to this day, he is not described as a god. We should also understand Juche not as a religion, but as a replacement for a religion. A replacement that fulfills the humanistic need for ritual solidarity and to pay obedience to a supernaturally inclined being, while at the same time helping to preserve the Kim dynasty as the only legitimate source of power in the country. Getting reliable information on religion in North Korea is very difficult. Article 68 of the most recent edition of the North Korean Constitution guarantees the freedom of religious belief. In addition, there is a common assertion that the Bible in particular is completely illegal in the DPRK. However, this claim has always struck me as odd, given that North Korea has published its official translation of the Bible. It's a legitimate translation as well, virtually identical to the South Korean version, albeit with northern vocabulary. However, most defectors claim that they've never seen or read the Bible while living in North Korea, so it can be assumed that these government translations are reserved for use inside the few state-controlled houses of worship and are not available to the public. We do know that upon entering the DPRK, you must declare any literature that you bring into the country on the customs form. However, it doesn't specifically single out religious texts. I couldn't find any sources from the North Korean government that specifically address this issue either, so I decided to reach out to a representative of Koryo Tours, a travel agency that specializes in travel to the DPRK. I asked whether or not it was flat out illegal to bring any religious items into the country, even for personal use, or if the ban applied to the dissemination of religious material. They replied that while it was technically the dissemination that is illegal, that it was best to not bring any religious material into the country to avoid any potential issues, and that any religious material could be confiscated upon arriving at customs. With this information, I think we can infer that even if it isn't de jure illegal, it is in the de facto sense. Nevertheless, of the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity maintains the most significant presence in the country. There are a handful of Christian churches of various denominations. North Korea has also allowed deacons from Pyongyang to visit Rome on occasion for theological training. These churches are open to foreigners and tourists alike and offer a rare insight into how these churches operate. There is controversy as to whether or not the locals who attend these churches are legitimate believers or are simply there for appearances. In an article written by KJ Kwan and Paula Hancox for CNN, Father James Pak, a South Korean priest who regularly visited North Korea's Changchun Catholic Church in Pyongyang, recalled the following. When we first arrived at Changchun Church, North Korean followers came out, then immediately rushed to a nun who traveled with me and jumped up and down, bursting into tears, said Father Pak, a South Korean priest with Missionaries of the Sacred Heart. These people haven't seen a nun in 50 years. That's when I realized that they are indeed followers. Father Pak goes further, explaining that in the 14 years that he had been a priest at the church up to that point, he had always believed that his congregation was genuine in their belief and never thought that they were fake believers, adding that most of his flock were of advanced age, having been baptized before the Korean War. Andrei Lankoff adds further clarification to this claim, stating in the same article that, quote, even if some members are true believers, they are selected by the government, the police authorities, the secret police are checking your background. So, with the information that we have, we can conclude that North Korea probably does tolerate a small, elderly Christian population who were baptized before the Korean War, but that these people are all likely screened for ideological purity well before they are allowed into the pews. There are also likely government minders mingled with the true believers in the church to ensure that no seditious activity is taking place. Moving on away from Christianity, as far as Islam is concerned, there is one Shia mosque within the Iranian embassy, the only mosque in the country. However, due to the location within an embassy, we can infer that it is for Iranian officials and is not accessible to the public. This means that Islam has no official presence in the country proper. This point, I believe, is further reinforced in an article written for NK News titled, What Do North Koreans Know About Muslims, Mosques, or Islam? Defector Shim Tae-il explains that he'd never seen or heard of a mosque before, adding that the only time Islam is ever mentioned is in world history when the instructor is talking about the Middle Eastern nations that were invaded by the United States for oil. Regarding Judaism, there are no synagogues anywhere within the country. North Korea does not recognize Israel as a legitimate state and has a long history of anti-Semitic attacks against Jews and Israel, as well as fighting against Israeli forces in conflicts such as the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. Regarding Eastern religions, North Korea does maintain several Buddhist temples that have existed in the country for hundreds of years. These temples are operated and regulated by the Korean Buddhist Federation, an extension of the Workers' Party of Korea. These temples are populated by monks who are employed by the Workers' Party. It should be noted that in every article I could find on the subject, it is stated that these monks are primarily there for upkeep and not for worship, as the temples are popular tourist attractions, and that any appearances of religious ceremonies are only to demonstrate that North Korea allows for religious freedom. The only religion that appears to have any sort of acceptance in North Korea is Chandoism. As discussed in my previous video on North Korea's minor political parties, Chandoism is actually represented in the North Korean government by the Chandoist Cheongdu Party. Further evidence of North Korea's accepting nature towards Chandoism is an article written by KCNA, North Korea's state-run news agency, which boasts that Chandoism is, quote, the national religion of Korea, due to its history as an anti-foreign and later anti-imperialist resistance movement against the Japanese. Favor does not mean independence, however. The Chandoist Cheongdu Party is still subservient to the Workers' Party of Korea and is essentially an empty husk used to maintain the illusion that North Korea is a multi-party democracy. It is worth mentioning that it is the only religious institution with representation in the North Korean government. It's just important to understand that it's only for show. Despite the occasional outward appearance of religious tolerance, defector reports indicate that religious freedom is among the most repressed in the world. People who openly profess adherence to a particular religion face workplace discrimination and social ostracization, and even imprisonment or execution if defector reports are to be believed. In an article written for North Korea News titled Growing Up Godless in North Korea, one anonymous defector reports that although they were taught about the major religions around the world and even of Korea's religious history, there was always the caveat that religious belief wasn't for them. Furthermore, these instructions about faith were part of world history classes, and that there are no theological classes in the country to the defector's knowledge. In addition to the lack of theology, the defector further goes on to describe the secular nature of the North Korean school curriculum, saying, quote, "We were also taught science, evolution and genetics, as well as the Big Bang. We never believed, as many do, that God created the universe. We knew why life existed and that the evidence supported these scientific theories. To believe anything else was irrational, silly," the defector notes. The idea of North Korea's educational system being entirely secular is not a surprising fact to learn, nor is the fact that the regime would urge its citizens to abstain from religion. However, what can we infer about what happens to those who do choose to adopt a religious faith? The answer is not clear. The anecdotal reports from defectors which describe death or imprisonment for those caught with religious beliefs are numerous. However, as numerous as they may be, they are anecdotes, thus unfalsifiable, and are not helpful as evidence at face value. They do, however, give us a starting point from which to investigate these claims. Unfortunately, there's virtually nothing outside of defector testimonies on the subject. The only other sources seem to be from the North Korean government, which are unreliable for obvious reasons. Even the great Andrei Lankov admits that there is a lot of ambiguity regarding faith in North Korea. In an article for NK News titled Christianity in North Korea Behind State Propaganda, Andrei Lankov states, "While the North Korean authorities have actually created a number of carefully watched churches which largely or exclusively serve the purpose of external propaganda since the late 1980s, how many of the priests and attendees are real believers and how many of them are props acting in accordance with the script is unknown." Furthermore, in that same article, Lankov explains that while North Korean citizens do have the right to religious freedom on paper, there is also a clause within the North Korean constitutions that stipulates, "Religion must not be used as a pretext for drawing in foreign forces or for harming the state and social order." This clause essentially gives the state free rein to determine what constitutes subversion or harming the state and social order, thus giving the state an infinite pretext to detain believers at will. It is noteworthy to mention the aforementioned fact that the locals who are spotted in North Korean churches are all of advanced age. In episode 137 of the North Korea News podcast, Guest Peter Prove, the director for the International Council of Churches, an international organization of Christian churches that often deals with North Korean Christians, goes on record by stating that, according to defectors, young people can't attend any church services or become members of the church. They exist solely to cater to the small aging populations of Christians that still exist from the old days, and to present the illusion of religious freedom. Insofar as to what extent underground churches exist isn't well known. In an article written by defector Kang Ji-min for North Korea News titled "Does Religion Survive in North Korea?", author Ji-min explains that the underground churches have been all but liquidated by the North Korean authorities, with those who have been caught facing severe penalties up to and including capital punishment. This is especially true for South Korean faith-based NGOs who are caught trying to proselytize in the country. Ji-min goes on, saying that while there is a bleak picture for Christianity being severely repressed in the country, North Korea has witnessed a revival of Korean shamanism, mainly in the form of fortune-telling. This is apparently so popular that there is a rumor that even Kim Jong-Il himself occasionally visited these fortune-tellers for advice. So what conclusions can we come to regarding religion in North Korea? Testimonies from defectors, NGOs, and North Korean scholars all agree that despite the nation's best efforts to present itself as tolerant of religious belief, North Korea's government is the most oppressive force on earth for believers caught within its boundaries. Although select faiths like Chandoism and Christianity are recognized, they are regulated by a state apparatus that ensures that those who associate with the churches are under the watchful eye of the Workers' Party, all the while forcing its citizens to accept a quasi-religious cult that raises its leaders on a pedestal to the detriment of everyone else. Despite the bleak picture depicting the iron boot of totalitarianism squashing those who step out of line, faith nonetheless persists in North Korea, just as it did in every other country that tried and failed to eradicate one of the most fundamental characteristics of human nature. Religion exists and will continue to exist in the DPRK, so long as people choose to have faith. This has been Jesse from Joseon Punsok. Please like and subscribe for more content. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and as always, I hope you all have a great day.